If you must be disappointed so that I can stay true to myself, then accept that disappointment. Because before I betray myself, I'd rather forgo your applause. In this audiobook, you will find no empty promises and no sugar-coated truths. I'm not here to soothe you. I'm here to shake you awake, to ask you the question you've been ignoring far too long. Are you living for yourself or for everyone else? My happiness is not up for negotiation, not for harmony, not for approval, not out of fear of being inconvenient. If it bothers you, it's making an impact, and that's exactly why you're here. Chapter 1. The Price of Silence. I never thought my greatest betrayal would be so quiet. It wasn't a big lie. No scream, no dramatic turning point. It was much smaller and much more dangerous. The first time I felt something and still said nothing. The moment something hurt me and I played it down. When something felt unfair and I still smiled. This subtle pattern of swallowing my thoughts, wrapping my anger in politeness, just so as not to disturb anyone. I wanted to avoid conflict, and in doing so became a minefield myself. Only I tried hard that nobody would step on me. That's where it began. I did it so often that I eventually convinced myself it was better that way. Silence was a sign of maturity. Yielding was reasonable. Not everything needed to be said, especially not if it would only stir more unrest. Every time I kept quiet, a part of me adapted so it could go on. But it never really lived, and silence feels like a solution for a long time, until one day you don't know who you are when you're not silent. I thought I was being considerate. I thought I was keeping the peace. I thought I was protecting relationships. But the truth was, I'd erased myself. I wasn't seeking peace. I was seeking invisibility. And if you make yourself invisible often enough, eventually others stop seeing you. They don't hear you. They stop factoring you in, not because they're cruel, but because you taught them to. You teach people not only by what you allow, but also by what you keep quiet. And I kept quiet about so much, for so long, that the image others had of me was comfortable for them, but not for me. I became the one who never gets angry, the one who always helps, the one who endures everything, the one who makes no trouble. They praised me for things I wasn't proud of, thanked me for sacrifices I never wanted to make, celebrated my patience, which in truth was nothing but exhaustion. And meanwhile, a resentment grew inside me that I couldn't even name, because I no longer knew who I was actually angry at. But at the core, it was clear. I was angry at myself, because I kept silent again and again, even though it hurt. And by doing so, I gave others the power to carry on. I'm not only talking about personal relationships. I'm talking about the job where I demanded too little, the friend who overstepped, the family that expected more than I could give, and about myself, who allowed it all. Silence feels like control at first, but at some point you notice the conflict hasn't disappeared. It has just moved inside you, into your insomnia, into your irritability, into that constant unease you can't name. You wanted to avoid the argument, and you traded it for a war within. One that is quietly wearing you down, day after day. I was exhausted without having done anything. Exhausted from myself. Exhausted by the role I played so others would have it easier. I had no energy left. No drive. Not because my life was awful, but because step by step over years, I had abandoned myself. When you remain silent too long, you lose the sense that you have a right to words. You think it's too late, that nobody's listening anymore. Or, worse yet, that you're just causing trouble. Conflict-prone. That word haunted me for years. It sounds so elegant, yet it's nothing but a clever way to silence people who only want to say, "This I do not accept." I didn't want to disturb, and in the end I was the only one standing in my own way. Until one day, something burst out of me. No scene, no drama, just one sentence. One honest sentence. And the world didn't end. Nobody hated me. Some were surprised, others moved. But I felt alive. For the first time in a long time. It was as if I'd found my own voice again. It wasn't easy. Because when you've been silent for so long, your own voice feels foreign. You doubt it. You tremble. You wonder if it was necessary. But deep down you know. The moment you stand up for yourself is the moment there's no going back. The price of my silence was high. I no longer heard myself. And if you don't hear yourself, you eventually live only in have to. In should. In everyone expects me to. That kills you. Not all at once, but slowly. It kills joy, spontaneity, curiosity. You function, but you don't live. And nobody notices, because everyone's grown used to you being that way. But you know. I learned. Clarity is not cruelty. Honesty is not aggression. Authenticity is not selfishness. And if that bothers someone, it's only because my silence was more convenient for them. Sometimes it's not about getting louder, but simply about stopping swallowing the things that eat you from within. Silence is also a choice. And whoever stays silent bears the consequences. If you keep swallowing everything, you eventually explode, and you no longer even know why. I don't want to explode. I want to live in peace. But in real peace. Not in that facade of peace that survives on my hiding so others feel good. That peace cost me too much. It cost me energy, dignity, emotional health, years. Parts of myself I now am only slowly reclaiming. And now that I have them back, I'm not giving them up again, especially not for silence. So no, I will not be silent anymore. Not to calm you, not to avoid arguments, not to be the one who understands everything. If something bothers me, I will say it. If something hurts me, I will show it. If something makes me angry, I will name it. Not because I want to fight, but because I finally want to be at peace with myself. And that is worth more to me than any praise. Because whoever is silent makes themselves invisible. And I am no longer willing to erase myself inside just to fit the picture on the outside. Chapter 2. My happiness is not a referendum. It took me a long time to understand that I don't have to ask anyone's permission to be happy. Not my parents, not my partner, not my friends, not the society that for years told me what happiness is supposed to look like. That I had to be something, achieve something, or own something before I was allowed to feel it. And every time I followed that unspoken script, I drifted further from myself. Because the happiness they trained me for wasn't my own. I spent years making decisions as if I were trying to win a popularity contest. Always watching how it was received, what it triggered, whether someone might disapprove. I made myself smaller so I wouldn't seem arrogant. I postponed dreams because they felt too inconvenient. Poured myself into roles that fit others better than they fit me. And in the midst of all that conformity, something crucial got lost. My inner compass. The quiet conviction that I'm allowed to trust my own feelings, even if nobody applauds. You don't suddenly become this way. It starts innocently. You make a choice and immediately hear, "Really? You want to do that?" Or, "But that doesn't suit you." And because you want to belong, because you don't want to upset anyone, you second-guess yourself. And if you do this often enough, you unlearn listening to yourself first. You become an expert at pleasing others, while you yourself grow emptier. I was addicted to approval without even noticing it. I measured my self-worth by how little friction I caused. When everyone was happy with me, I thought everything was going well. But what's going well when you lose yourself doing it? When your inner yes is quieter than every external no? I remember moments when I felt bursting with joy and still held back because I knew my happiness would be questioned. Maybe because it was inconvenient. Maybe because it didn't fit the image people had of me. And so I learned to moderate, to hide, to tone down my happiness. As if I had to filter it through society first. As if it needed an outside okay to be real. But happiness is not a democratic process. It isn't a collective decision. It's not an invitation for everyone to vote on my life. And the sooner you realize that, the freer you become. Not ruthless, not cold, but clear. I stopped explaining my choices. Not out of arrogance, but out of self-preservation. There comes a moment when you realize you don't want to waste your energy constantly justifying yourself. When you get tired of having to lay out your motivations so others feel comfortable with your path. Because what good does it do you to debate your life if in the end you still bend yourself out of shape? I recall a conversation that felt like a punch to the gut. Someone said directly, "You've changed. You're not the person we knew anymore." And they were right. I wasn't that person anymore. I was someone who for the first time had started taking myself seriously, who stopped making compromises that drained him inside. And of course that bothered people. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I stopped playing along. People quickly get used to you conforming, to you stepping back, to you functioning. But when you suddenly stand up and say, "Not like this anymore," that's when the real challenge begins. Because then you find out who really sees you and who only liked the convenient version of you. Happiness makes you vulnerable, especially when it doesn't match expectations. If you dare to live differently, there will always be voices questioning you, some openly, others subtly. A sidelong glance here, a remark there. Why do you always have to do things your own way? Do you think you're better than us? And suddenly you're doubting a happiness that actually feels good, just because it ruffles feathers. But eventually I understood. It's not my job to make my happiness understandable. It's not my duty to make it acceptable or comprehensible. It's enough that it's mine, that I feel it, that I wake up in the morning without the sense that I have to push myself through the day just to meet expectations. I stopped questioning my decisions simply because they didn't fit the familiar picture. I stopped slowing down my pace just because others walked more slowly. I stopped feeling guilty when I felt good, while others couldn't. Because compassion doesn't mean you have to suffer alongside them. It means you show up honestly, but not at the cost of yourself. And that is one of the hardest sentences I had to learn to say. My happiness is not negotiable, not because I'm stubborn, but because I tried too long to make everyone happy, except myself. And one day enough is enough. It's uncomfortable to position yourself so clearly. You will face misunderstandings. You may lose people who no longer know where they stand. But what you gain is incomparable. Yourself, your inner space, your own voice, your peace. And that is worth more than any pat on the back. I long thought harmony was the highest good, that everything is better if no one offends. Today I know, harmony is worthless if you pay for it with your truth. If you constantly backtrack just so it stays smooth, you eventually stop swimming. You just drift. And drifting is not living. I have chosen not to drift any longer, but to walk, upright, consciously, not against others, but finally for myself. If that bothers you, you're free to leave. If it surprises you, feel free to ask. But I will not stand still any longer just so you feel more comfortable on my path. Because my happiness is not up for a vote. It is not a matter of consensus. It is not a draft I submit for approval. It is the consequence of finally stopping bending myself, of finally starting to listen to myself, even when the world outside was loud. I do not live to avoid disappointing you. I live so I no longer disappoint myself. And that step was the most radical form of self-respect I have ever experienced. Chapter 3. Being selfish saved me. It took me a long time to realize that the problem wasn't the word selfish, but what I had imagined it meant. In my head, selfishness equaled callousness, coldness, that uncomfortable feeling of doing something at the expense of others. I had learned that you must not put yourself first, that you must give, show understanding, be there, always available, always stepping in, always open to the needs of others. And I was good at it. Too good. I was the one who called when you were in crisis, who listened even when I had no strength, who put my own issues aside because someone else had it worse. I told myself that was strength, that it was noble to take a back seat, that life simply works that way. One suffers, the other supports, and that I was the supporter. And I was proud of it, because there is so much affirmation when you forget yourself but remain useful. People love that. They cling to you, calling you reliable, selfless, warm-hearted. And eventually you believe it yourself, until you wake up one morning and don't even know how you feel, because you have spent years caring only for everyone else. I was tired, not from action, but from constant self-neglect, from that silent, mounting exhaustion nobody saw because it didn't make a scene. I functioned, I laughed, I listened, and inside I was empty. Not because I had nothing left to give, but because I never learned to keep something for myself. I remember a phase when I began doing small things for me. I said no sometimes. I took an afternoon off without explaining. I didn't answer messages immediately. And what happened? People were unsettled, asked questions, gave me subtle hints that I was changing, for the worse, that I was suddenly selfish. And right then, it clicked for me. When self-care is labeled selfishness, there is something wrong with the system we live in. Then, I can't right now becomes an affront. I need space turns into an attack. And I understood that it wasn't my selfishness that was the problem, but others' dependence on my constant availability. So I began saying no, not out of spite, but because I knew that every yes I gave out of exhaustion was a betrayal of myself. I began guarding my time, my energy, my boundaries. And it was hard, because nobody applauds when you start protecting yourself. It's quiet, awkward, sometimes lonely. But for the first time, it was real. I had to learn that I don't owe anyone just because I've always been there. That I'm not less lovable if I take myself seriously. That my needs aren't worth less because I ignored them for so long. And that love, true love, allows space for growth, for boundaries, for silence. During that time, I shed many roles. The helper, the problem solver, the you can always count on me type. And I'm not saying I'll never be there for people again, but now I show up only when I truly can, without inner resistance, without the bitter feeling of betraying myself. And that is the difference. Selfishness was my lifeline, not because I stopped seeing others, but because I finally started seeing myself. I had become so used to putting myself last that I thought it was normal. But normal isn't always healthy, and healthy often feels rebellious at first, when you've been conditioned your whole life to forget yourself. Today I set boundaries that would once have seemed like walls. I speak up about things I once would have swallowed. I step back when I feel myself slipping away, and I do it without guilt, but with clarity. With that calm, non-negotiable conviction, I am responsible for myself. And that is not a cold stance. On the contrary, I have more warmth in me since I stopped being drained. I can love more honestly because I'm not constantly operating from a deficit. I am more present because I'm not already thinking about what I have to do next. I didn't become a bad person by caring for myself. I became a whole person. It puzzled people, of course. Change does that. Those who only liked you when you were self-sacrificing won't celebrate your return to yourself. But that's okay, because I'm not here to meet expectations. I'm here to live authentically, and if that means seeming selfish, so be it. You see, selfish has been used so often to keep people small when all they want is to protect their boundaries. But I now take it as a compliment, because I know what it means for me. It means no longer betraying myself, no longer exploiting myself, no longer dismissing myself just because it might be more convenient for someone else. I almost lost myself because I thought my worth lay in being useful. I thought love had to be earned. I thought presence meant sacrifice. But I was wrong. And that mistake nearly destroyed me. Being selfish saved me. It gave me back my life, my energy, my dignity, my voice. And if someone doesn't understand that, it's their issue, no longer mine. Chapter 4. Applause doesn't fill you. It always felt good when someone clapped, when I received praise, when I saw the sparkle in others' eyes because I once again did exactly what they expected of me. I was talented at it. I knew how to appear. With a few words, I could carve out a space for myself. I knew how to behave to harvest approval, in family, at work, among friends. And eventually I confused it with love. I mistook it for meaning. I believed that this warm echo from outside would ground me, but it never lasted. The applause was there as long as I performed, as long as I functioned, as long as I was someone who pleased. And that is the crux. I pleased. I wasn't necessarily myself, but I was well received. And that was enough for a time, enough to feel needed, enough not to question whether what I showed was what I really felt. I had learned that you have to be something to get attention, and I'd figured out how to shape myself to keep that attention as long as possible. But what I never learned was what remains of me when the applause fades. There is a silence after the applause that nobody mentions. When the room is empty, when everyone has moved on, when you're standing there alone, no stage, no smile, nothing to deliver. That is when you feel that the applause was never for you as a person, but for the image you provided. And that can be devastatingly painful. I tried for a long time to prolong that echo. I outdid myself. I adapted. I did things that weren't true to me, just to keep shining. But eventually, even that wasn't enough. Eventually, you run out of breath. And then you find yourself realizing that all the praise won't catch you when you fall. Because praise only warms you briefly. And if you're empty inside, approval will never fill you. It may boost you for a moment, but it won't nourish you. You can hear 10 times how great you are, and still feel something's missing. Something real. Something that doesn't depend on what you do or achieve, but on who you truly are when nobody's watching. I ignored that emptiness for too long. I thought I just had to keep going. Get better, give more, please more often. I was like an endurance athlete in an emotional marathon, constantly chasing the next high from outside because I no longer felt myself inside. It was an addiction, but not one that's easy to spot, because it doesn't look destructive. On the contrary, you're admired for it. People love it when you give your all, when you shine, when you push beyond your limits. It's that subtle form of self-sacrifice celebrated because it's so useful to others, to the system, to the image they have of you. But you pay, and you pay with yourself. Applause will never be enough if you need it to feel worthy. And I don't say that out of bitterness. I say it from experience. I know what it's like to be praised for things that feel hollow inside. I know what it's like to deliver the perfect facade while you recognize yourself less and less. And I know how quiet it gets when you do something that truly aligns with you, and nobody applauds. And that is where healing begins. The moment you're ready to not be loved for something you're not. The moment you value your own judgment of yourself above the judgment of the crowd. The moment you stop selling yourself for a bit of recognition that never lasts. I began asking myself, would I do this if no one saw it? If there was no applause? If nobody patted me on the back for it? And if the answer was no, I knew, I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for the image, for the echo, for the role. I don't want to be an echo anymore. I don't want to be a mirror for others' expectations. I want to hear myself, to feel myself, even if that means it gets quieter on the outside. Even if I stop fulfilling expectations that were never mine. It was a long road to realize that. Because applause is like a drug. It makes you feel light, fast, awake, but it doesn't last. And then you need more of it. And you do more to get it. And in the process, you lose piece by piece access to what you really need. Yourself. Today I know that my value cannot come from outside. Not sustainably. Not deeply enough. And that true connection, to others, but above all to myself, only arises when I'm willing to be imperfect, uncomfortable, even without a stage. Today, I do things that nobody sees. I make decisions that serve me well, even if nobody understands. I live so that I don't feel empty at the end of the day, even if I get no applause. And it doesn't feel spectacular, but it is honest. And it endures. Because at the end of the day, I don't want to be admired. I don't want to be applauded. I want to be myself. No mask, no show, no hunger for the next well done. Applause did not give me what I truly needed. And I am finally ready to let it go. Chapter 5. I am not responsible for your discomfort. It wasn't easy to grasp. Not because it's complicated, but because I had learned my whole life otherwise. I thought that if someone felt uncomfortable because of me, when my words triggered something, when my decisions irritated or hurt someone, it was automatically my fault. I thought I had to smooth it over, retract, explain, make myself smaller so as not to offend. I believed harmony was always my responsibility. And with that belief, I made myself liable for everything others couldn't bear in me. I began policing myself. Choosing my words with surgical precision. Thinking before every conversation about how I might come across. Analyzing whether someone might feel hurt, even if I was honest and had attacked nobody. I worried about how to package my truth so that it hurt as few as possible, even when I was bleeding inside. I became a master at cushioning impact. I could sense when someone grew tense, when my clarity was too much, when my decision didn't fit their image. And what did I do? I stepped back. I adapted. I said, it's okay, even though it wasn't. I stayed silent, though everything in me screamed to speak. I took on responsibility that wasn't mine, just to save the mood. But over time, almost unnoticed, I paid the price for it. Because if you're always trying to maintain everyone's emotional balance, eventually you yourself collapse. You keep smiling, but it feels like muscle cramps in your face. You give in, but each time a bitter taste remains. You feign understanding, though you feel betrayed inside. And one day you notice, what you defend, the fragile equilibrium, isn't real. It's an illusion that eats you up from within. I often thought I was too sensitive, that I felt too much, thought too much, noticed too much. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was I couldn't distinguish what belonged to me and what didn't. I too often made others' inner turmoil my own. I took their insecurity, their uncertainty, their fear, and believed I had to change so they'd feel better. But the clearer I became, the more I saw. I am not the tranquilizer for others' restlessness. Realizing that was a harsh cut, because I knew this new stance would have consequences. If you stop feeling responsible for what others see in your mirror, you lose sympathy. You're labeled difficult, demanding, cold. Not because you treat people poorly, but because you stop contorting yourself for others' comfort. And yes, sometimes my clarity is uncomfortable. Sometimes my decisions hurt someone. Sometimes my boundaries are perceived as an attack. But that is no longer my issue. Not because I don't care, but because I've learned that I can't help anyone by losing myself. I often heard people say, "The way you say it makes me sad," or "Your stance unsettles me." And I took it seriously. Of course I did. I'm an empathetic person with compassion and a desire to be fair. But one day I asked myself, who takes me seriously if I betray myself just so you feel better? For too long I believed I could please everyone if I only tried hard enough. I thought I just had to find the right words, the right dosage, the right tone. But it doesn't work. There will always be someone whom your change scares, who feels threatened by your courage, who feels attacked even though you're just drawing your boundaries. And that is not your fault. The truth is, some people can only handle you as long as you don't fully show yourself. And when you then show yourself, when you speak your mind, express your needs, make your decisions, you become inconvenient. But that discomfort often has more to do with them than with you. You're only holding up the mirror, and not everyone is ready to look into it. I had to learn to withstand that discomfort, not to resolve it immediately, not to reflexively compensate for it, but to stay there, in my clarity, in my calm, in my right to respect myself, because I can't help it if someone prefers to hold on to an image of me that no longer fits. It is not my task to take away others' unease when they themselves are unsettled by my authenticity. I gave myself permission to stop being the buffer, to be honest, even if there is tension, to leave things unsweetened. And I experienced that genuine connection can withstand it. That people who truly want to see me don't run away when it gets serious. That relationships, whether friendships, family ties, or professional bonds, do not break apart just because I stop making myself small. Living this way requires courage, but it's the only path that truly feels like life. I am no longer willing to pay for peace that is based on my self-denial. I am no longer willing to feel guilty for what others can't handle in me. I am no longer willing to apologize constantly just because I dare to be real. I am not responsible for your discomfort. And if you still choose to see me, if you still choose to stay, then I know I am not alone. But even if you don't, I remain true to myself. And that is enough. Chapter 6. Who were you before you adapted? I asked myself that question far too late. Maybe because I was too busy saying the right thing, behaving appropriately, meeting expectations, and above all, not standing out where I wasn't asked to. Maybe also because I was so deep in that role that at some point I confused it with myself. And yet there came a moment when the mask grew heavy. Not all at once, but like a stone in your pocket that gets a little heavier each day, until you start to wonder why you're so tired, despite doing everything correctly. I don't know exactly when I began to twist myself into shape, but I remember the feeling that it was necessary. Perhaps as a child, at school, at home, on the street. You learn early on what works. Be quiet, be nice, be helpful, stand at the back, fit in. Don't make a fool of yourself. And woe betide you if you're too much, too loud, too sensitive, too honest, too different. So I learned to observe, to analyze, to feel what was expected of me, and then deliver it. I adapted because I wanted to belong, because I wanted to be loved, because I didn't want to be the exception. I swallowed my opinions, hid my desires, tamed my anger, and every time I held back a piece of myself, I got something that felt for a moment like safety, but never like freedom. I became good at keeping up appearances. I was someone people liked, someone they found pleasant, uncomplicated, strong, balanced. I knew the script, and I played my part as if it were my own. But deep down I knew this wasn't entirely me. And the longer I played, the harder it became to remember who I really was before I started. I first took that question seriously when I noticed my reactions were no longer my own. I laughed when I didn't really feel like it. I said yes while everything inside me screamed no. I kept conversations going that long ago left me exhausted. And I wondered, who would I be if I let all that go? If I no longer cared what others saw in me? If I didn't have to adapt to be accepted? The answer didn't come as a thought. It came as pain. Because before I could be myself, I had to mourn. Mourn the years I denied myself. The times I swallowed my truth to keep the peace. The energy I used to make myself smaller, quieter, gentler, even though I was so much more than that. I had to let go of what had protected me, yet also confined me. Adaptation is a survival mechanism, and often it was necessary. We adapt because we sense our authenticity isn't welcome, that we're only safe if we play the game, if we don't stand out, if we're like everyone else, or at least pretend to be. And that tactic works, but it exacts a price, because the longer you adapt, the further you move from your core. I began to dig, not to reinvent myself, but to retrieve myself. I asked, what did I love as a child before I learned what sensible means? When was the last time I said something without censoring it 5 times in my head first? When did I feel alive? Not because I pleased someone else, but because I was true to myself. I remembered that version of me, loud, wild, curious, asking questions even when no one liked them, feeling without shame, moving without constantly checking how it looked. And I felt how far removed I had become, not out of malice, but out of fear, out of a deep desire not to be abandoned. But at some point I realized I had already been abandoned by myself. So I slowly began to allow myself to be me again. I stopped filtering everything. I said things even if they caused tension. I took up space even if it bothered someone else. I stayed silent when I had nothing to say, instead of forcing hollow conversations. And I finally stopped apologizing for the way I feel, think, or live. It wasn't pleasant. Change is rarely pleasant, because it also means loss. I lost people who couldn't follow. I lost roles that once protected me. I lost that illusion of control over how I was perceived. But I gained something I never want to lose: authenticity. That quiet, deep alignment of what I say, think, and feel. I am no longer willing to mold myself so someone else feels more comfortable. I am no longer willing to censor my truth because it seems too direct. I am no longer willing to serve up my being in digestible portions. Because I've realized, if you're always adapting, you'll never be fully seen. Only parts of you. Only what's convenient. But that's no longer enough. Not for a life that feels real. Who was I before I adapted? I was a person with edges and angles, with dreams that didn't fit every mold, with a voice that wasn't always quiet, with a heart that felt clearly, even when it was uncomfortable. And I still am, That part of me remains beneath all the layers I put on to belong. I am still here, and I'm coming back. Not loudly, not rebelliously, but calmly. Awake, determined. Because I no longer want a life that just works. I want one that reflects me. Chapter 7. I don't want to be strong. I want to be free. I was taught to be strong, not in the classic physical sense, not with a clenched fist, but with a firm jaw, a controlled voice, a posture that doesn't waver even when everything inside is shaking. I learned early that strength means enduring, not complaining, not showing when something is too much. And eventually that became normal. It was like wearing an invisible badge. You can count on me. I can handle this. I've got it. And I handled it. I carried it. I functioned. Even when inside I couldn't anymore. And every time I didn't break down, when I kept going though I was empty, when I stayed silent though I screamed inside, the confirmation came. Those looks of respect, that pride from the outside, that you're so strong. And I clung to it as if it were a compliment. But deep down I knew it was a cage. Because that so-called strength wasn't my freedom. It was my defense mechanism, my armor. And at some point it got so heavy that I could hardly feel myself beneath it. I was so busy holding everything together that I forgot to ask whether I even wanted to. Whether it was really my job to cushion every blow, to always be stable, to always have a plan, a solution, an answer, a strategy so nothing spirals out of control. I spent so much energy appearing strong that I didn't notice how deeply I was trapped in a life that no longer felt like mine. I was exhausted, not from doing, but from avoiding. From avoiding every sign of weakness, every moment of vulnerability, every honest reaction that might show I didn't have everything under control. And I began to ask myself why I was so afraid to just let go sometimes. The answer was painfully clear. I was afraid that without my strength, nothing would work anymore. That relationships would fall apart if I wasn't the one carrying everything. That I'd disappoint people if I wasn't always available. That they'd see me as unstable if I didn't always know what to do. I had held up that image for so long that I began to measure myself against it. And anything that didn't fit got pushed away. But then that moment came. No big bang, no catastrophe. Just a day when I simply couldn't anymore. When my body rebelled, my thoughts swayed, my breath went shallow. And suddenly I heard that question inside me. What's it all for? For whom? What do I gain by holding on, inside a system that consumes me? In a life that feels more and more like a battle, and less like a choice. And I realized, I don't want to be strong anymore. If strength means forgetting myself. I don't want to function just because I can. I don't want to automatically say yes because I'm used to it. I don't want to constantly prove I can handle everything on my own. I don't want to live in a mode where self-sacrifice is confused with responsibility. I want to be free. Free to fail sometimes, without judging myself. Free to say honestly, I can't do this right now. Free not to be the rock that holds everything together. Free to feel what I feel, without labels, without explanations. Free to let go of what traps me, even if it looks comfortable. And I know, freedom sounds romantic, like open doors, like vast skies. But in reality, it's brutally honest. It forces you to look closely. It confronts you with your illusions. It makes you see how much of what you called strength was really just over-adaptation. And it asks whether you're ready to let all that go, even if it means losing people. Even if it disappoints expectations. Even if it shatters the image you've upheld for so long. I've begun to live that freedom. Hesitantly, tentatively, sometimes in fear, but also with growing clarity. I've started saying no where I would have once said yes. I've taken breaks even when no one officially allowed them. I've shown myself with doubts, questions, cracks, and you know what? The world didn't end. Yes, there were people who didn't understand, who saw my change as withdrawal, who were disappointed because I was no longer available the way they were used to. But I've learned that I'm not responsible for maintaining their idea of me. I'm not the product of their expectations. I'm a person, and I'm allowed to grow, to change, to let go, to start over. This new kind of strength I live now feels different. It has nothing to do with hardness, nothing to do with pride. It's soft, quiet, clear. It doesn't come from willpower, but from honesty. And it allows me to do things I never dared before. Show weakness, accept help, set boundaries, endure emptiness, allow feelings, even when they're uncomfortable. I stopped measuring my worth by my resilience. I stopped celebrating myself when I overran my limits. I stopped believing it was admirable to lose myself, as long as everything ran smoothly. Today, I no longer ask if I'm strong enough. I ask if I'm free. If I make decisions that come from me, or from fear. If I live how I want to live, or only how I'm expected to. If I'm connected to myself, or just adapted to everything else. And whenever I sense I'm slipping back into old patterns, into that constant holding, carrying, functioning, I remind myself, I'm not here to be strong. I'm here to be free. And that's exactly how I want to live. Chapter 8. I'm not here to fulfill expectations. It was a silent break. No big drama, no public uprising, no liberating shout into the wind. It was more an inner moment, almost unnoticeable but definitive. The moment I realized I'm not here to fulfill what others have imagined. That my existence isn't an extension of someone else's dreams. That my path isn't meant to fit into foreign molds just because they're familiar. I had tried for so long to meet expectations, not because they were ever clearly spoken, but because they felt like laws, often silent, sometimes in a look, in a sentence, in an unspoken disappointment that was still palpable. I was the daughter who was supposed to function, the friend who had to be understanding, the colleague who remained reliable, the version of me that helped others confirm their ideas of life. And I could do that. I was good at playing those roles. I learned what was wanted, and I delivered. I was disciplined, controlled, ready to perform. I fit in, smiled even when I didn't feel like it. I said yes when I would have preferred to scream no. And every time I slid into the right image, there came that silent reward. Recognition, belonging, peace. But it was never my own peace. It was the peace of others who didn't have to question me as long as I stayed how they knew me. Yet the longer I lived that way, the more pressure built. Not from outside, but within me. A quiet resistance that eventually became inner friction. It simply didn't fit anymore. I no longer fit into what I had built. And at some point I realized I was living a life that didn't belong to me. One that was maintained and admired, but hollow inside. Because when you exist only to meet expectations, you lose your connection to yourself. You become functional but no longer alive. You move but never arrive at yourself. And eventually you stop asking what you want and only ask, what do they require of me? What can I show without rocking the boat? What can I feel without disappointing? I did that for years. I succeeded at it. I got jobs, relationships, validation. But it always felt more like a transaction. I give up myself, so you leave me in peace. I play along, for peace in return. And eventually, even that peace grew loud. A deafening silence in my core telling me, it can't go on like this. So I began to respond differently, to act differently. I said no where a yes was expected. I stayed silent where I once offered excuses. I withdrew even though it was read as indifference. I stopped apologizing for who I am or who I'm not. And yes, It confused people. They sensed the change and didn't always want to understand. They didn't ask directly, but they pulled away. Not out of malice, but because I no longer fit the frame they'd built of me. And I let them go. Not out of coldness, but because I understood that each time I forced myself back into the old mold, I lost a piece of myself. And I had already lost enough. My intuition, my joy, my spontaneity. Those moments when you laugh without watching yourself. I wanted them back, not just in theory, but tangibly. I refused to live in fear anymore. Fear of not measuring up. Fear of disappointing. Fear that someone will leave if I'm honest. Because if someone only stays because I meet their expectations, then they're not really with me, but with the role I'm playing. And I refuse to build my life on a facade. I'm not here to fulfill expectations. I'm not here to be pleasant, to function smoothly, to be a good son, a dutiful daughter, a perfect partner, a collegial teammate. If it means abandoning myself, I'm here to experience myself, to get to know myself in my contradictions, in my depth, in my clarity that can be uncomfortable. And I've learned, whoever truly loves you doesn't need a script from you. They don't need a controlled version or polished behavior. They can bear witness when you show yourself. They stay even when you don't function. And they grow with you, instead of keeping you where you're supposed to stay. I will disappoint expectations. I know that. I already have. And I will do so again. But I will no longer disappoint myself just so others won't question themselves. I will no longer shrink my truth because it doesn't fit someone else's life plan. I will no longer present myself softer than I feel because clarity isn't to everyone's taste. Because I'm not here to fulfill your idea of me. I'm here to do justice to myself. And that changes everything. Chapter 9. When I said enough, I didn't recognize myself. It didn't come with a bang. No drama, no scene, no impulsive reaction to regret later. It was an enough that grew inside me. Quietly, slowly, almost unnoticed, until it became inevitable. And when I finally spoke it, loud and clear, it was as if someone else spoke through my mouth. Not because it wasn't my truth, but because I couldn't remember ever being so resolute. I had been silent for so long, nodding, enduring, mediating, yielding, that this one word, enough, felt like a break. Not with the world, but with myself. With the image I had of myself. With the person who always understood, always forgave, always gave one more chance. This enough was like holding a mirror to my face, and I saw someone I didn't know. Someone no longer willing to bend. And that was new for me, because I was always the peacemaker, the compromiser, the one who would rather lose himself than disappoint someone else. I was practiced at explaining myself, justifying myself, showing understanding, even when I was too drained to do so. And that role had become so ingrained I didn't even question it. I believed it was simply who I was, my way of loving, living, functioning, until I couldn't anymore. Until I realized I was acting not from inner strength, but from exhaustion. That my compassion was laced with a quiet, nagging anger I wouldn't admit to myself. That my adaptation no longer spoke of freedom, but of fear. Fear of standing alone, of being rejected, of being deemed difficult. And so I stayed silent. Too long. But the moment came anyway. The moment something inside me refused to cooperate. When I opened my mouth and spoke words that echoed inside me like a foreign sound. Not like this anymore. That's it. I still remember how calm my voice was. No trembling, no tears, no drama, just clarity. And yet I felt as if I'd crossed a line of no return. What surprised me wasn't others' reactions. It was my own. I was stunned by my own resolve, by my hardness, not in a destructive sense, but in the sense of consequence I'd never learned. I sat there after saying enough and wondered, who are you? Where does this strength come from? And why does it feel so alien, even though it comes from you? And then I understood. I had said not only no to a situation, I had said no to a whole way of life, to a dynamic that had crept in over years, to a version of me that sacrificed itself for harmony, belonging, peace. I'd said yes to myself in clarity that startled me at first, because I knew if I meant this seriously, much would change. And it did. I lost relationships, or rather, I stopped holding on to them even though they exhausted me. I provoked opinions because I no longer agreed just to belong. I made decisions that were uncomfortable for me and for others. But for the first time, I felt I was truly on my own side. It wasn't just a liberation, it was a reconquest. Because that enough wasn't an end. It was a beginning of something real. Not smooth, not comfortable, not free of conflict, but honest. And that was new. I got to know myself anew, no longer as a reaction to others, but as an active force, as a person with boundaries, with needs, with a voice that no longer wanted to whisper. It was uncomfortable to see myself that way, not as the victim asking for understanding, but as the person taking responsibility, who stops making himself small to remain acceptable, who is willing to endure the friction that arises when you step out of roles, patterns, relationships that only work while you play along. I was often asked what happened, why I changed, if I'd been hurt, if I was angry, if I regretted anything. And I couldn't always answer clearly, because much of it wasn't explainable in one sentence. But inside I knew. I hadn't suddenly become someone else. I had only stopped hiding. That enough wasn't an outburst. It wasn't a loss of control. It was the moment I first listened to myself in full responsibility. And yes, it scared me, because it felt so foreign, because it didn't feel like the person I'd been. But the longer I lived with this new clarity, the more I recognized I hadn't changed. I'd returned to a part of me I'd long suppressed, returned to a voice that was always there but never loud enough, returned to a truth I knew before I learned to tame myself. I didn't recognize myself then, because I'd been lost too long. But today I do. Not in perfection, not in adaptation, but in clarity, in decision, in the strength not to betray myself anymore. And that was the beginning of everything. Chapter 10. What you allow, you teach. For a long time, I believed my silence was generosity, that my understanding was strength, that my perseverance was maturity. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I put up with things, if I held myself together, I would create harmony. That then people would surely see what I needed, even if I didn't say it. That they'd notice my boundary, even if I didn't draw it clearly. But they didn't notice, because I never taught them. There's an uncomfortable truth few want to hear, one I avoided until it finally hit me in the middle of everyday life, at a perfectly ordinary moment when someone spoke over me again as if I were air. And I sat there, as so often, caught between anger and exhaustion, and suddenly thought, I allowed that. Not for the first time, and not out of stupidity, but out of habit. What you allow, you teach. Not on purpose, not consciously, but with every repetition. Every time you stay silent while something inside you screams. Every time you smile, even though you're hurt. Every time you remain understanding, even though you feel unseen. You teach others how they may treat you, what they can say, how far they can go. And where there's no resistance, entitlement grows. I've experienced this on so many levels, in friendships, in relationships, at work. Time and again I sensed the moment I should have said stop, and I didn't. Not because I was weak, but because I still hoped courtesy would be returned, that the other would realize I'd had enough, that they'd think, I can't do that to her. But no, people often orient themselves not to your inner pain, but to your outward behavior. If you act as if everything's fine, they believe you, and eventually a cycle begins that's hard to break. You endure more than you should. You forgive faster than you can heal. You give more than you have. And when you finally raise your voice, it hits others like a shock. Not because you're overreacting, but because you've taught them otherwise. I remember a conversation that still sits heavily in my gut. Someone said to me, astonished and almost reproachfully, I don't recognize you like this. And it was true. I didn't recognize myself either. Because I had grown used to protecting others' comfort, even at my own expense. I'd become an expert at tolerating things just to keep the peace. And eventually I became the permission others felt free to claim. What I learned was hard, but it was honest. You don't always get what you deserve. You often get what you allow. And if you don't defend yourself, no one will do it for you. Not because people are cruel, but because you're signaling, this is okay for me. Even when it isn't. Boundaries aren't unkind. They're clear. And clarity is the opposite of coldness. It's not an attack if I tell you you've crossed the line. It's not drama if I draw a boundary before I explode inside. It's not a betrayal of trust if I withdraw because I see I can't grow in this dynamic. It's self-respect. And yes, I made mistakes. I forgave far too often without realizing I was perpetuating a pattern that kept me small. I repeated, they don't mean any harm. So often I eventually believed it myself. But it doesn't matter if someone means harm. If the result is that I feel small, empty, or overlooked. You can lose yourself even wrapped in the kindest package. I had to learn that the hard way. I had to collect many little violations until I understood. It's not the big catastrophe that breaks us. It's the tiny shifts we endure every day. The comments we ignore. The infringements we rationalize. The requests we swallow. The disappointments we mask with a smile. And eventually there's a deep crack we ourselves have allowed. The good news is, once you've taught it, you can unlearn it and teach a new way. You can meet people differently. You can begin to change your responses. You can stop excusing everything. You can start feeling yourself, naming what's right for you and what's not. You can allow yourself to be uncomfortable, knowing it isn't escalation, but a return to yourself. I always thought that setting boundaries would cost me people. But in truth, I lost myself because I set none. Today I know. Every moment I defend myself is a moment I teach that I matter. And anyone who can't handle that never cared about my real self, but only the role I was willing to play. So I teach anew, not through theory, but through behavior. I teach through clarity, through consequence, through repetition. And each time I take myself seriously, it becomes a bit easier not to fall back into old patterns. Because what you allow, you teach. And I'm finally ready to show something different. Chapter 11. I don't want to belong. I want to be at peace. I tried for a long time to make myself fit in, to blend in smoothly, to avoid causing friction, to be as inconspicuous as possible. I knew exactly how I had to speak to be accepted. I knew which parts of myself were better kept tucked away if I wanted to belong. And I did it. Again and again, in different groups, in various contexts, with people who were sometimes close to me, sometimes less so, but the pattern remained. Adapt in order to be part of something. And it worked. I was noticed. I was included. I was part of something. But what nobody had told me, belonging at any cost eventually stops feeling like connection and instead becomes a constant internal compromise that quietly but persistently erodes your own boundaries. It's the kind of belonging where you are allowed to belong, as long as you don't show certain things, don't say them, don't feel them. It took me many years to recognize that this was no longer enough for me. Because at some point you realize you're in a room that's full, and yet you feel lonely. You laugh at things that don't truly move you. You nod at opinions that aren't yours. You stay silent where you would like to speak. And everything inside you knows, this isn't real. Not for you. Maybe for the others, yes. But you yourself aren't fully you in this group. This has nothing to do with arrogance, nor with ingratitude. It's not a rebellion. It's simply a deep, honest need for peace, for that feeling of being at home in yourself, without being on guard, without having to police yourself, without constantly analyzing whether what you're saying or doing fits into the social fabric you're painstakingly supporting. I used to think I was searching for community, for connection, for a place where I could say, this is where I belong. But today I know that this was not what I was really looking for. I never tried to fit an image because I found it beautiful, but because I hoped that behind it lay something that would grant me inner peace. I hoped that belonging would bring peace. But I've learned, if you have to pretend to belong, you won't find peace in it. You'll only find more rules you must obey so as not to stand out. And that changed me. I began to become quieter, not indifferent, not distant, just more awake. I observed how I behaved in groups, in conversations, in moments when something inside me rebelled, and yet I swallowed it down. And each time I noticed it, it became harder to justify myself. I could no longer lie to myself. I knew. I am tired of belonging. I don't want to be part of something anymore that forces me daily to play a version of myself that pleases others more. I don't want conversations anymore that exist only to maintain surface-level niceties. I don't want to sit in groups where opinions are more important than humanity. I don't want to laugh when I don't feel like it, and I don't want to have to justify my depth just because it doesn't match the pace of the group. I'm not seeking a clique, a scene, or a network. I'm seeking peace. An inner state in which I can say what I think without fear that the atmosphere will shift. In which I can sometimes say nothing and still stay. A state in which I don't have to explain anything because my being is enough. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. And yes, that desire has led me out of some circles, not abruptly, but consistently. I began declining invitations I'd previously accepted out of politeness. I let contacts fade, not out of disinterest, but because I was honest. This doesn't serve me. It doesn't nourish me. It only asks me to be someone I'm no longer. What surprised me wasn't the loss of those bonds, but what emerged in their place. Suddenly, it became quiet, clear. I had space. Not the loud, chaotic space full of voices, but the space in which I could hear myself again. I regained access to what I truly want. I felt when I missed someone, and when I didn't. I could distinguish what closeness is, and what is merely habit. Peace is not a spectacular state. It doesn't shout. It doesn't entertain. It doesn't show up in photos. But it's the only thing that truly matters to me today. And I am ready to no longer fit everywhere. I'm ready to appear odd, to be quieter, to be less accessible. Not out of defiance, but because I've learned that I can only truly breathe where I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to belong anymore. I don't have to prove myself anymore. I don't want to be compatible anymore. I want to be honest. Because peace begins when I stop standing in my own way, just so I won't stand in the way of others. Chapter 12. Pretending wore me out. It didn't happen overnight. There was no conscious decision, no calculated plan. Nobody forced me. And yet one day I stood there with a face that was no longer mine, words on my lips that felt hollow, an energy that didn't return. I had played myself out, not physically, but spiritually. That deep, heavy, relentless tiredness that doesn't let go even if you've slept 8 hours, gone on vacation, meditated, or gone for a run. Because it has nothing to do with rest, but with the price you pay when you abandon yourself over years just to avoid standing out. For a long time, I didn't notice that I was pretending. I thought that's just how life is, that you pull yourself together, that you keep certain things to yourself, that you simply persevere. I thought you only show as much as is pleasant for others so it doesn't get too complicated, that you remain professional, appear strong, stay in a good mood. I thought that was strength, discipline, maturity. But it was only exhaustion wearing a friendly face. I knew exactly how to move in rooms. I knew how to present myself, how to hold back, how to dress appropriately, what to say, how to smile even when everything felt overwhelming. And I got recognition for it. I was seen as composed, stable, resilient. And at some point I confused that mask with myself. I thought, this is me. Until my inner self stopped playing along. At first there were small signs, irritability in moments that would once have meant nothing, sudden tears over trivial things, that emptiness after a long day, even though objectively everything had gone well. And then the resistance arrived. I woke up and didn't want to talk, not to smile, not to listen. I just wanted to be still, without having to explain myself. And I could no longer ignore it. I was empty. Because I had forced myself to appear whole for too long. I didn't lie. I simply omitted. Everything that didn't fit the image I had built over years. The doubts, the fatigue, the anger, the insecurity. I censored myself. Not out of malice, but because I believed that my true self would be too much. Too demanding, too intense, too unpredictable. So I showed what was easily digestible, what was well received, what worked, and it worked. But it distanced me inwardly, from myself, from others, from everything that had originally mattered to me. I could observe myself in conversations, how I spoke, nodded, analyzed, but felt nothing. I could laugh while desperately wanting to retreat. I could listen even though I couldn't absorb anything. I was present, but not really there. It was a silent burnout. No drama, no breakdown, just a constant tiredness reminding me, this isn't yours. This is a role you play because you're afraid you'll fall if you become honest. But you're already falling, only inward. I remember a day when I simply couldn't play along anymore. I was sitting in a room full of people I actually trusted, and everything in me wanted out. I couldn't endure the conversations, the smiles, the clichés, the game we all played so well. And I left, just like that, without explanation. I picked up my bag, stood up, and walked away. And that was the first moment in a long time when I felt myself again. I hadn't said a word. I hadn't hurt anyone. I had simply left. But inwardly it was a revolution. Because for the first time I hadn't done what was expected of me. I hadn't played. I hadn't faked. I had listened to my body, to my exhaustion, to my anger. And that was the first step back to myself. It was a painful process, because when you stop performing, you encounter resistance. People don't understand why you're suddenly different. They take it personally. They ask if something happened. And sometimes they don't know themselves, but they sense. You're not playing along anymore. And that changes everything. Because whoever stops pretending forces others to face what they'd rather ignore. I lost many of those connections. People with whom I had shared years, but who had related mainly to my mask, not to my real self. And that hurts. Because you wonder, Was there ever genuine closeness? Or was it just mutual validation based on half-truths? But I also gained other people. Genuine connections. Quieter, clearer, slower. Relationships in which I don't have to be on all the time. In which I don't have to explain why I speak less today, why I don't laugh, why I just want to be. People with whom I don't perform but simply exist. Pretending wore me out. And I never want to go back there. I want to show myself, even if it's uncomfortable, even if not everyone likes it. I want to be allowed to be tired, sad, angry, uncertain. I want to be able to say, not today, or I don't know right now. I want to live, not just perform. And for that, I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to appear strong. I just have to be honest. With myself first, then with others. It's not comfortable, but it's real. And being real is the only thing that no longer exhausts me. Chapter 13. Being happy doesn't make me a bad person. There is a silent guilt you don't notice at first. It doesn't creep in with loud thoughts or obvious conflict. It whispers in the background. When you laugh while others suffer. When you experience success while someone beside you fails. When you simply take a breath and notice that your happiness disturbs others. You don't feel it immediately, but eventually you begin to ask yourself whether you're even allowed to show so much joy. Whether your light takes up too much space. Whether your happiness hurts someone who isn't feeling it right now. I've experienced it often. Whenever I was truly doing well. When I'd achieved something. When I blossomed. When I honestly said, I am content. Then applause didn't always follow. Sometimes there was silence. Sometimes a cutting remark. Sometimes that subtle sense that you should make yourself smaller so as not to provoke. I knew it well. That breaking. That cautious dosing of your own joy so it doesn't come across as arrogance. So you don't hurt anyone. So you don't become too much. But at some point I began to question myself. Why does my happiness require explanation? Why must I apologize when I'm doing well? Why should I wait until everyone else feels good before I can honestly show myself? The answer hurt. Because it revealed how much we've learned to hold ourselves back so as not to offend. How we dim our shine out of fear, it might blind someone. How we've learned to feel guilty when we experience feelings that don't fit the general mood. But my happiness is not an insult. It is not a comment on another's pain. It's a state that didn't arise at someone else's expense. I didn't steal it, force it, or buy it. I earned it. Sometimes through tears, sometimes through deep loneliness. Sometimes against massive inner resistance. I didn't just receive it. I allowed myself to have it. And that was the greatest hurdle. Because being happy means not only that life is going well right now, it also means that you stop locating yourself in everyone else's pain. That you detach from the notion that you must shrink yourself to belong. That you leave behind the old story where suffering equals depth, and happiness is superficially dismissed. I know what pain is. I know what loss means. I know the feeling of questioning everything. But precisely for that reason, I take my happiness seriously today. I don't treat it as a given. I don't celebrate it immoderately. But I no longer hide it either. I've realized that I don't help anyone by sabotaging my own life just so that others don't feel challenged. If you sit in a room feeling bad, no one dares to say they feel good. And so a silent agreement arises that we collectively reduce ourselves to the lowest common denominator. Muted joy, cautious optimism, tempered contentment. But that can't be it. We're not here to live in a perpetual loop of moderation. It must be allowed to feel good, even if not everyone shares that feeling at the same time. I've learned that my happiness can also inspire others, that it doesn't always trigger envy, but also hope, that it can serve as an example, not of perfection, but as a sign that it's possible to heal, that one can arrive, that one can allow oneself to enjoy again, even knowing heaviness. But for that, I had to free myself from that secret guilt that kept creeping back. The voice that said, "Now don't overdo it. Now don't openly show how good you feel." The fear that someone would feel overlooked when you follow your own path. But eventually, it was enough. I could no longer remain considerate of a world that had grown used to deprivation and forgotten that joy is as much a part of being human as pain. I stopped holding myself back. I began to laugh out loud without looking around. I allowed myself to be proud when I accomplished something, not to boast, but to honor myself. I stopped apologizing when I found myself in lightness while others remained in heaviness. Everyone has their own pace, and I had slowed mine for far too long. Feeling happy is not a betrayal of the world. It's not a message that you've forgotten others. It's not a lack of compassion. It's simply the natural state that arises when you find yourself again. When you come to rest inside. When you stop living against yourself. And that shouldn't seem suspicious. It should inspire. I no longer want to throttle my happiness. I want to share it, if someone is open to it. I want to keep it, if someone doesn't understand it. I want to feel it, fully. Because deep down, I know how hard it was to get here. And because I've realized that it's not noble to shrink yourself just so no one else awakens. I can be happy even if you're not. And you can be sad even if I'm laughing. Both can exist side by side, without guilt. Chapter 14. Not everything that hurts moves you forward. I've heard this phrase many times. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I nodded, cited it, even said it myself in conversations, moments when I tried to find some meaning in the pain that overwhelmed me. I wanted to believe that all that suffering that shaped me led somewhere, that it wasn't in vain, that it built me up, made me wiser, more mature, more aware. I needed that, because it's hard to sit in the midst of pain and admit that it simply hurts, without a takeaway, without deeper meaning. But at some point I was ready to see it honestly. It was after one of those phases when everything inside me was screaming, when I gave myself daily pep talks, hoping it would soon be over. And then I stood there, exhausted, drained, not stronger, but emptier than before. And I knew this was not constructive. It didn't build me up, it wore me down. It exhausted me, and it created nothing I wanted to keep. Not every pain brings insight. Not every hardship is transformative. Not every tough experience carries a gift. Saying that is uncomfortable, I know. It contradicts all those romanticized ideas about growth, about resilience, about the nobility of perseverance. But I want to be honest today, with myself and with you. There are things that simply destroy, that burn, that overwhelm, that pull you into a depth where you don't automatically learn something, but where you first have to survive. I tried to find a lesson in everything, in every rejection, every loss, every conflict. And yes, there are times when you later understand why something happened, when you sense, with distance, that you've grown. But that's not always the case, and it doesn't have to be. Not every cut needs to become a scar you look back on with pride. Some wounds may simply heal on their own without turning into part of a heroic narrative. It's dangerous to glorify pain, because you begin to seek it as if it were proof you're on the right path. You stay too long in relationships that hollow you out because you believe love must be work. You fight through jobs that make you sick because you tell yourself it shows character. You stay silent, endure, and function because you regard suffering as a necessary stage, a test, a gateway to something bigger. But what if that's not true? What if pain isn't a springboard but a dead end? What if the only right thing is not to interpret it but to leave it? What if it's not about enduring it, but about recognizing you should have walked away long ago? I didn't allow myself to ask these questions for a long time. I thought that would be weak, ungrateful, cowardly. But today I see it differently. It takes real courage to admit to yourself that you're suffering, and that there's no noble reason for it. I'm not here to demonize pain. It belongs to life. That much is clear. I've learned a lot through crises, through loss, through mistakes. But I've also lost much in places where I stayed too long. I wasted energy in dynamics that didn't move me forward. I exhausted myself in battles that never needed to be fought. And I defended people who took more from me than they gave, in the hope that enduring it would make me grow. Today I know, enduring is not a sign of maturity if it breaks you inside. Persevering is not proof of strength if you lose yourself in the process. And suffering is not a badge of depth if it permanently distances you from yourself. Sometimes true progress isn't about surviving, but about ending. I had to learn that the hard way. I had to pull myself out of situations that demanded everything from me. I had to stop telling myself it would pay off someday if I just stayed strong long enough. Because eventually I realized, strength isn't about enduring everything. It's about knowing when enough is enough. It's about not destroying yourself for the promise of a reward later. Not everything that hurts moves you forward. Some things just quietly and thoroughly destroy you. Accepting that wasn't an act of surrender. It was the beginning of something else. Of clarity. Of inner responsibility. Of the decision to no longer turn everything into meaning just so you wouldn't feel how much it hurt. I'm tired of making every low point into a story with a moral. I want to allow myself to say, that was shit. That was unfair. That hurt. And I don't want to romanticize it. I may recognize something as harmful without having to transform it into a life lesson. I may walk away without naming some grand learning objective. I may say, that destroyed me. Period. Because in that honesty lies another kind of strength, not one defined by pain, but one that no longer needs it to feel itself. Chapter 15. I am too much for someone who wants too little. For far too long I believed I was the problem. Too intense, too honest, too direct, too sensitive. I questioned my way of feeling, my depth, my presence, my need for genuine connection. I asked myself whether I should be less, quieter, simpler, more agreeable. I doubted myself, not because I didn't know who I was, but because I repeatedly found myself in situations where my presence couldn't be held. And eventually I began to think, maybe I truly am too much. Too much for people who only show up halfway. For conversations that cling to the surface. For relationships that only feel safe when you quiet down, when you hold back, when you carve yourself away bit by bit so you fit into the small measure the other person is willing to give. I made myself small so I wouldn't be noticed, so I wouldn't be a bother, so I would stay, even though everything in me longed to leave. I made compromises that were no longer compromises. I accepted being taken in portions, that my heart was too direct, my words too clear, my expectations too real. I heard that I shouldn't ask for so much. That love means freedom. That closeness doesn't necessarily mean intensity. That I should have patience. And I did. Far more than was good for me. But eventually the moment came when I looked in the mirror and no longer knew who was standing there. Because I had served myself in stages, out of fear of being too much for someone who only wanted a part-time relationship, part-time connection, part-time responsibility. I thought that by diminishing myself, at least I wouldn't be alone. But I was already alone. In the relationship, in the conversation, in the closeness that never truly felt like closeness. I am not too much. I am simply not for everyone. Realizing that set me free. It wasn't an act of arrogance, no pride, no defense mechanism. It was a quiet revelation that gave me back my ground. I am not wrong just because I want depth. I am not overwhelming just because I wish people would truly show themselves. I am not complicated because I don't shy away from conflict, but see it as part of a real connection. It takes courage to endure that. Not just for me, but for anyone who refuses to hide. Because whoever shows themselves challenges others. Whoever is honest brings others into contact with what they'd rather not feel. Whoever is consistent allows no room for games of half-truths. And whoever loves without losing themselves sets a clear boundary, even if it's hard. I no longer justified myself. Not for my tears, not for my longing, not for my clarity. I didn't apologize for wanting to be seen, for not being overlooked, for not being bypassed. I didn't invent stories to excuse others' disinterest. I didn't say, they simply can't do better. I realized it's not my job to teach someone how to treat me. It's my job to decide where I stay and where I go. And I left. Quietly but decisively. From half relationships, from one-sided conversations, from dynamics in which I had to lose myself in order to be loved. I left, not because I was too much, but because I am exactly right as I am, just not in the wrong place. I have found people who can hold me, not in the sense of possession, but of presence. People who don't flinch when I am direct, who don't run away when it gets difficult, who don't withdraw when I clearly state what I need. People who aren't threatened when someone stands beside them who knows themselves. It's not too much to want genuine closeness. It's not too much to want to feel seen. It's not too much to honestly say, I don't want half measures. What's too much is the endless waiting for someone who will never come. What's too much is the constant explaining of why you won't settle for the minimum. What's too much is the pain that remains when you deny yourself just so as not to disturb. I have disturbed enough. I don't want to be silent anymore in order to belong. I don't want to be convenient anymore so as not to be abandoned. I don't want to wait until someone realizes what I'm worth. Whoever cannot see me as I am will not recognize me if I contort myself. I'm not too much. I'm exactly right for someone who isn't afraid of real contact, depth, responsibility, of a love that's there not only when it's easy. I am not a test. I am not a puzzle to be rationalized. I am a human being with a story, with open wounds, with clarity and flaws. Whoever wants me must learn to handle authenticity. Whoever only likes me when I hold back will lose me once I begin to take myself seriously. I am not here to make myself smaller. I am here to show all of myself. Chapter 16. Masks weigh heavier than failure. I have never been afraid of failing. Not really. What troubled me most was not losing itself. Not the fall. Not the shame that sometimes clings to a failed project, a broken relationship, or a decision later shown to be wrong. I could handle that. It hurt, yes, but it was real. I could live with pain as long as it came from something true. What destroyed me in the long run wasn't failure. It was hiding. Wearing the mask every single day. Having to function while everything inside is unstable. Showing strength when you've long since run out of reserves. Exuding composure when you lie awake at night wondering how much longer you can endure it all. Always pretending everything is under control, even as you lose yourself on the inside. That's not protection. It's a constant inner burden that, over months, sometimes years, slowly crushes you. I wore the mask often. I can't even tell you when I put it on the first time. Maybe in school. when I learned it was better not to stand out with too much emotion. Maybe later, at work, when they said you had to stay professional, calm, objective, ready to perform. Maybe in relationships, when I sensed that my insecurity, my vulnerability, wasn't welcome. That people preferred the pleasant, reliable version of me over the whole real person. And I functioned. I was strong. I was resilient. I was dependable. I was everything people wanted me to be. But at some point I simply couldn't anymore. Not because life grew too heavy, but because the mask grew too tight. It stole my breath. Not all at once, but little by little. Every day a bit less of me. Until one morning you wake and no longer know what you're even responding to. Whether you're acting on your own will, or only on what's expected of you. And that, right there, is where the silent, paralyzing state begins in which you function, but no longer live. I remember a seemingly mundane moment. I sat at a table with people. I laughed. I spoke. I listened. Everything looked normal. And then I no longer felt myself. It was as if I were watching myself from a distance. I did everything right, but nothing felt like me. And I knew, this isn't real anymore. I'm not present here. I'm just a well-rehearsed role. The problem with the mask is not only that it separates you from others, it separates you from yourself. You become an actor in your own life. And even if you succeed, even if you receive praise, even if everything looks perfect on the outside, you feel empty, because none of it truly touches you. You cannot arrive if you haven't shown up internally. I asked myself what I feared so much that I hid myself. The answer was terrifyingly simple. I was afraid of not being enough, that my real self was too sensitive, too unclear, too imperfect, that I'd get hurt if I showed up, that I'd lose if I was honest. So I kept up the image. I worked. I smiled. I performed. And I waited for a feeling of peace that never came. Because peace doesn't arrive as long as you're pretending. Peace grows not from perfection, but from sincerity. And one day, when I was alone in the midst of another one of those endlessly functional weeks, I realized I'm more afraid of being discovered than of failing. And that is the real betrayal of myself. I don't want to shine anymore when it's gray inside. I don't want to be nice anymore when I'm angry. I don't want to look strong when I'm breaking inwardly. I want to be allowed to fall, and for it to be visible. Because only then can real connection happen. Only then does someone even have the chance to catch you. And only then do you give yourself the chance to rise again. Not as a copy, not as a facade, but as you. I've learned that you gain nothing as long as you hide, because what you get while wearing a mask doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the role you played. It isn't your true self, but the version you projected. And when that crumbles, you stand with empty hands. Not because you failed, but because you were never really you. Failure is human. It belongs to life. It's not a flaw. Sometimes it's even the start of something genuine. But the constant self-denial, that is a slow self-loss far more destructive than any failure. Because you don't lose yourself to something external. You lose yourself piece by piece. I don't want that anymore. I don't want to prove I can do everything. I don't want to function so nobody notices how often I doubt. I don't want to define myself by performance, by image, by impressions. I want to feel again what I really want. What nourishes me, what defines me, even if that means sometimes being weak, uncomfortable, chaotic, honest. The mask gave me protection for a time, but it didn't save me. It isolated me, and it kept me from learning that even my imperfect self is enough. I had to take it off, not because I was ready, but because I couldn't breathe anymore. Failure is not the opposite of success. It's proof that you tried. A mask, however, only shows that you didn't dare to try for real. Chapter 17. Your comfort is not my priority. I spent my entire life convincing myself that shrinking to please others was an act of consideration, that withholding my truth was a form of selflessness to avoid conflict, that I proved good manners by silencing my needs and placing everyone else's well-being above my own. But one day I realized I wasn't being considerate. I was abandoning myself, and that's not a virtue. It's a surrender. There were moments I consciously filtered what I wanted to say or feel, so that no one would feel uncomfortable. When I noticed that speaking up would force someone else out of their comfort zone, and I stayed silent. When my inner compass urged me to stand up, make a change, or set a boundary, and I held back so as not to cause a scene. That silence may have brought peace, but it didn't build connection, only a facade. I remember a situation where I knew I had to speak, not out of rebellion, but out of self-respect. Yet the voice resonating in the room forced me to remain quiet. Not another fight now. So I stayed silent. Later, when I was alone, I felt that icy calm that spreads through you when you betray yourself, because you didn't raise your voice, yet you stayed silent. The problem is that you lose your own significance along the way. You become invisible, even though you're physically present. You accommodate others until you overlook yourself. And at some point you realize that the so-called harmony isn't really harmonious. It's unfair. For the one who gives themselves away because they feel unwanted whenever they occupy space. I understood that, and not through rose-tinted glasses. I learned there's a difference between acting with care and giving yourself away, between noticing others' needs and silencing your own because they're inconvenient. I learned that becoming uncomfortable isn't cowardly, but often the opposite, and that prioritizing myself isn't cold, it's necessary. I drew boundaries even though it hurt. I said, I can't, even though I sensed it would spark waves of questions. I changed rooms because what I needed didn't match what others wanted. And it was hard, not loud, but consistent. And I felt my voice mattered, not because it was loud, but because it was real. You don't lose friends by honestly naming what you need. You only lose those who aren't willing to see you as you are. And that's exactly the point. Your comfort is not my priority. I can understand your discomfort without giving up my truth. I can empathize with your exhaustion without letting it steer me. I can show compassion without denying myself. I learned to read situational cues differently. When someone says, "You're too direct," I know they may not be at peace with themselves. When someone says, "Now's not the time for conflict," it often means, "I don't want to look," not, "You're wrong." And that teaches me that their comfort zone has nothing to do with my inner world. Being present means defending your right to space, not with force or arrogance, but with clarity. You can stand your ground without pushing others down. You can advocate for yourself without silencing them. I chose this because I no longer want to give away my time simply to adhere to silent rules that mute me. This is not a call to selfishness. It's a plea that our truth needs room to exist, that our inner balance is worth more than a calm surface, that the cost of erasing yourself is often higher than the cost of standing up. And I chose. I stand up, not against you, but for me. Not quietly, to avoid conflict, but honestly, to find peace, so we both see what truly matters. Again, your comfort is not my priority. My truth is the only thing I no longer keep silent about. Chapter 18. Conflict is not failure. For a long time, I believed arguments must be avoided. That disharmony is a sign of weakness. That you only function well, as a couple, as friends, as a team, if everything remains calm, if no tensions surface, if everyone always agrees. So I learned to rein in my tone, suppress my impulses, swallow my criticism, not out of cowardice, but out of fear of what might happen if I voiced what had long been felt between the lines. But that silence wasn't peace. It was stagnation, not real understanding, but cautious circling, like people who don't truly meet, but merely exist side by side to avoid collision. And one day I realized, this isn't closeness. It's a deceptive silence that eventually turns cold, because what remains unspoken rots inside. It accumulates. It festers. I learned that conflict doesn't mean something breaks. It means something moves. That there are two truths clamoring to be seen. Two perspectives confronting each other because it takes courage to be honest. And in that friction lies the possibility to truly connect. We live in a society that often strives to maintain harmony at the expense of authenticity. But harmony born of nobody daring to speak up is worthless. It's brittle, it's artificial, and it lasts only until someone can no longer stay silent. I remember the first time I spoke out loud what I'd been thinking for months. I knew it would hurt. I knew it would be uncomfortable. But I couldn't deny myself any longer. And when I spoke, I didn't tremble out of anger, but out of honesty. I said, I can't do this anymore. It hurts me. I need something different. And that moment, once a looming explosion, became a turning point. Not a break, but the first real connection. Conflict is not failure. It's a sign that someone is no longer willing to betray themselves just to preserve external peace. It's a sign of life, of depth, of investment. Because indifference doesn't argue. Indifference departs. It says nothing. It resolves nothing. It withdraws. Quietly, but definitively. I've experienced many conflicts. Some loud, some silent. Some about what was said, others about everything left unsaid. And I understood that it's not about always being right, it's about being honest. Willing to risk something because the relationship is more valuable than its image. I know not every conflict ends healingly. Some conversations lead to goodbyes. But even that isn't necessarily failure. Sometimes letting go is an act of respect, rather than staying in a space that offers no breath. And sometimes conflict is precisely the moment it becomes clear what is still possible, or what is no longer possible. Conflict can connect when you don't mistake it for attack, when you don't fight to win, but to understand, when you listen even if it hurts, when you wait not for a response, but for truth. It's not the argument itself that destroys relationships. It's the constant avoidance that hollows them out. I stopped apologizing when I spoke up. I learned that clarity can be louder than harmony, and that you're not unpleasant for showing yourself, but alive. Because whoever avoids conflict avoids themselves, and whoever allows no tension lives watered down until nothing real remains. I refuse to live watered down. I want people who are honest with me. I want closeness robust enough to withstand a real no. I want spaces where anger is allowed as long as it reveals, not destroys. I want conversations that happen even when they get uncomfortable. Because life begins exactly there, beyond the constant all good. And I will stay true to myself, even if it means things get rough. I'm no longer afraid of that. I'm afraid of losing myself again because I thought I had to keep everything smooth. I've discovered that I often feel more connected in conflict than in silent conformity. Because then I see you, and you see me. Not through a smile that says nothing, but through a boundary, through a demand, through a sentence that may be imperfect but is real. Conflict is not a disturbance. It's an impulse. It shows that something still lives, that someone hasn't given up, that they won't settle, that they won't stay silent because it's easier. And that is not failure. That is the beginning of truth. Chapter 19. Freedom has consequences. You often sense it first as silence. This freedom, when you decide to stop functioning according to others' expectations. No achievements, no praise, no rescued harmony, just the clarity of having chosen for yourself. But this freedom does not come without a price. It demands space, time, and often more loneliness than you anticipated. It's not a fleeting liberation, but a journey with refunds, U-turns, and moments when you wonder if you really wanted it. Freedom means making decisions without other scripts playing in your head. It allows you to blaze your own trails, even if no one knows them. Those trails aren't comfortable. They're rocky, sometimes narrow, often lonely. You lose the familiar, the known, the secure. And then you realize those comforts were part of the freedom you sacrificed. With freedom comes responsibility. Responsibility for defending your boundaries, for owning your decisions, for enduring feedback that was never given before because you used to play along. Now you hear what it sounds like when people question you, when you become different. Not because you sought it, but because you no longer perform the role others assigned you. And that scrutiny, that vulnerability, is the part you underestimate when you romanticize freedom. The consequences don't stop at the surface. Inside, you face new uncertainties. Trust in yourself is tested because it's no longer propped up by others' stability. You're responsible for every word you speak, for every absence you allow, for every resistance you offer. And it hurts, because there's no fallback into old roles anymore. No protection in conformity. Freedom isn't the absence of conflict, but the admission that you're willing to fight for your truth, even if it costs. And these fights aren't hero tales. They happen in the office when you say no while everyone else says yes. They happen in the family when you're not a second self, but a person with your own needs. They happen in friendship when you're no longer naturally available, but choose consciously whether to be there. In all of this, you gradually realize freedom is not a reward. It's a decision you must renew daily, and it carries renewable consequences. Friendships that once ran on autopilot suddenly falter. You show up late or not at all, and those who don't adapt drop away. You leave old patterns you no longer want, but you must expect that some won't follow. Yet there is another side to this coin. Friendships are reborn or formed for the first time. Relationship structures that felt like burdens dissolve. Where clarity reigns, spaces form that allow genuine being. Where you no longer live in expectations, but in presence. And presence demands courage, especially when you muster it without prior approval. The consequences of freedom often oppose the desire for calm. They bring noise, valleys without support, the volume of your own thoughts, because no one but you carries the weight of your decision. And yet, it's precisely this restlessness that creates a depth you otherwise wouldn't reach. The awareness that every yes is grounded, every no justified, evokes respect within yourself. Returning to old patterns is easier than maintaining independence. Freedom demands that you stick with your choice, day after day. And that is the real test, often harder than any confrontation. Because you're not fighting others, but the temptation to revert, to the apparent safety of silence. But those who walk this path discover that freedom doesn't end. It expands. Relationships that endure grow deeper. Spaces you enter become more clearly defined, full of intention, not expectation. And you hear your own heart louder, because you no longer mistake the whisper of hidden compromises for your own voice. This freedom is not a conquest, but a living state. It's a constant dialogue with your truth and its consequences. It's more than the will to be. It's the courage to remain. In daily life, in conflict, in closeness. And with each of these decisions, you shape a life that no longer lives on applause, but in the freedom to choose consciously. Chapter 20. My happiness is non-negotiable, even if it bothers you. You've listened this far. You've witnessed how I reclaimed, bit by bit, what I had unlearned: my voice, my desires, my boundaries, my freedom. And here in this final chapter, there's only one thing left to say. My happiness belongs to me, and I will not give it up. Even if you find it uncomfortable, even if you dislike it, even if you think it has nothing to do with you. It's an experience unto itself to recognize you have a right to your own happiness. Not as a commodity, not as a reward for your efforts, not as a price someone must pay for you to exist, but simply as a state you deserve. You don't deserve it because you're worthy, but because you're human, because you exist, because you have the right to shape yourself so you can face the morning mirror without exhaustion in your eyes or emptiness in your smile. But this realization comes with consequences. It provokes reactions you never expected. People who once cheered you on may withdraw because your happiness no longer fits their narrative. Others react with irritation because you won't make yourself small to make them feel better. Some see in you a mirror of their own barriers they still can't bear to face as you clear yours, as you live differently, because you're allowed to. And that's the point. This happiness is radical, it's autonomous, it's independent, and that makes it uncomfortable for some. I remember times when I apologized for my happiness, particularly around those not yet as far along as I was. I shrank myself, smiled, softened. I conformed to preserve harmony. Yet my inner smile was broken, because it wasn't about harmony. It was about resisting my own existence. I understood that my happiness isn't a compromise. It isn't up for discussion. It's a fact. And I refuse to let anyone take it from me. That doesn't mean I lack compassion. Absolutely not. It doesn't mean I judge others for their path. I am, and remain, compassionate. But I am also clear. It's not my responsibility to make you happy, just as it's not your job to make me feel small. That mutual balancing must end. It once bound us in a loop where you needed me to feel better, I needed you to feel seen, and we sacrificed genuine closeness, growth, and difference. My happiness is non-negotiable because it's neither property nor performance nor mask. It's not an instrument someone can play, not a commodity someone can buy. It's what remains after all I gave up, and I have given up enough. I will not give myself away again, not for more applause, not for more approval, not for less conflict, but for more life. And yes, that means I no longer participate in certain things. I quietly part ways with those who stay near only if I conceal my pain, soften my boundaries, bend myself daily. I take space. I take distance. I take my life seriously. And that changes relationships. It challenges comfort. It pushes some away. And it hurts. But not as much as disappearing while no one watches. My happiness is non-negotiable. I will not yield because you want comfort. I will not yield because boring peace is easier than living silence that sometimes must be loud. I will not yield because it unsettles you when I move, when I live, when I show myself in all my incongruent, imperfect, sometimes fragile beauty. Being human is not an option, it's reality. And my happiness is part of that reality. I carry it. I do not hide it. It gets space. And I am ready to bear its consequences, not against you, but in my own name. This is where the bargaining ends. This is where real life begins. And if that bothers you, that's okay. Because it's not my job to preserve your peace. It's my job to take myself seriously. And I have. My happiness stands here, and it stays. Thank you for joining me until the end. If this audiobook moved you, accompanied you, or made you reflect, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss anything. And if you'd like, leave a comment. I want to know what touched you. Until next time.